Hi, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us. Thank you for being here. I'm so pleased to be speaking with Tahmima about her gorgeous forthcoming book, Uprising. Those of you who might have found this through Instagram, you'll know that for many years I did author interviews, and then for many years I did not do author interviews. And then I read Uprising, and I felt like I need to speak to Tahmima. There's so much to unpack here, and I need people to get excited about this book as well. Of course, it's not out yet, and I really want folk to read it, pre-order it, get your book clubs to read it once it is out. So I'm going to do a quick, brief introduction to Tahmima. I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions. You can put them into the chat box. Otherwise, at the end of mine and Tahmima's conversation, I'm happy to invite people to unmute themselves and ask the question orally, because it's always nice to be in conversation with you all. Okay, so Tahmima Anam is the author of the Bengal trilogy and a recipient of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book and the O. Henry Award. Her short story Garments was shortlisted for the BBC National Short Story Award. She is a grantor Best of Young British Novelist and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. She was born in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and she trained as an anthropologist at Harvard University and now lives in London. I think your training as an anthropologist just shines through in all of your books. You have such an eye for detail, Tahmima. Um, and honestly, I first fell in love with your writing when I read A Golden Age, almost 10 years ago. Is it 10 years old now, that book? Yeah. And
It's old. It's older
yeah,
than 10. Yeah.
is it older than 10? Okay, but
Yes,
I
yes.
just remember
Unbelievably.
it is beautiful. And I remember reviewing it on this back in the day, we were all on Facebook, and there was a Facebook group, and I reviewed the book, A Golden Age on there. And someone commented, you know, this is a trilogy, right? And I swear I didn't walk, I ran to get the rest of this trilogy, and it just did not disappoint. As someone with Pakistani heritage, I knew that Bangladesh had once been West Pakistan, but I had no idea of the history of Bangladesh's independence struggle, the brutalities of Pakistan. It was just such an education, and I still recommend that trilogy to people. And I actually remember handing that trilogy over to my mum because I was like, Mum, you really need to read this book too. You need to read these books and understand it from a different perspective, what happened. And I felt that same gutting, visceral truth telling unfold again in Uprising. And, as I said, I haven't done an author interview for years, but I dusted off my mic and said it's time with this book. So, for those who haven't read the book yet, and which is probably the majority of those who are here today, because the book is out in May, I believe, in the UK, can you please give us an introduction to Uprising?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you all so much for being here. And Sophia, it's such a delight to be in conversation with you. I so appreciate you supporting my work. It means so much to me. I respect you so much. I have so many questions for you. So we're going to try to stick to the book today and maybe have a different conversation another day offline. So this is Uprising. This is what it looks like in hardback. They just sent me the copies a couple of weeks ago. It's set on an island of sex workers in Bangladesh, which is a real island, although the island in the novel is not named, but it's based on a real island that I have visited. And it's the story of a group of women who are essentially trapped on this island. They've been trafficked there, and they are kind of ruled over by a sadistic madam who they called Amma, as in she's their mother figure, but also their kind of person who's imprisoning them. And it's essentially the story of how they escape their imprisonment. It's a story of a rebellion, and this rebellion is led by a young 15-year-old girl who shows up on the island almost by accident. Um, she sort of thinks that she runs away from her family in rebellion, and someone promises her a job, and instead they bring her to this island, and she's convinced that there's been a huge mistake and that she's going to be the one person who doesn't belong, who's going to get rescued by her family. Of course, she doesn't. And instead, she decides to bring all the women out of captivity.
Hmm. It's such a stunning book. And actually, it was only, I mean, you mentioned there that it's based on a real island in Bangladesh. And I actually only realized after finishing the book that this place exists, that it's called Banishanta. Can you tell us a bit more about this and your research process? How did you come to know about this island, and what was it about this island that sparked this book?
So very strangely, I was on honeymoon with my husband. I mean, we had just gotten married. It wasn't our official honeymoon, but my parents sent us on this boat trip to the Sundarban, which is the mangrove forest in Bangladesh. And we were in our 20s, and we took an overnight bus from Dhaka all the way down to the bottom of the country. And you end up on this port, and a boat picks you up at the port, and then the boat takes you deep into the jungle. And as we were floating by, one of the guides pointed out to me and said, "Do you know that this is a floating brothel?"
Mm,
And it was just this strip of sand, with these very shabby looking huts. And I really couldn't stop thinking about it. And
mm,
I went home and I did my research, and it was indeed a real place. And I thought, I started thinking about writing, placing a story there or setting a novel there. And to be honest with you, Sophia, I just couldn't bear the thought of living in that place in my mind for the time that it would take for me to write this book. And I thought, how can I do justice to this place? How can I make it real? What does it mean for me? And then I had the idea that I would write not about the place, but about leaving the place and about revolutions. And so much of my life and my family history, as you know from reading A Golden Age, has been sort of lived in the context of the sense of uprising and revolutions. So when I
mm,
had that thought, I thought, okay, I can write this book. And then I went and visited the island. I took a trip down. I was hosted by people who kind of work within the community a lot. I met the women, I befriended them, and the story sort of came from that experience, but also my deep desire to write almost like a sort of joyful, victorious story about probably one of the darkest places in the world.
mm. And you know what, Tahmima, as now that I've read that book, I can absolutely vouch for your having achieved that, because when you start the book and as you're reading the story of what's happening, it does feel so dark, and there were points where I had to just put it down. But you have this way of writing that just calls you back in as a reader. So it was compelling. I couldn't stop reading the book. And at the end of it, there was just the momentum really picks up, and I just felt like I was being tossed around in this typhoon, waiting for this absolute climax to occur. And at the end, I just, I said this in my reel as well, I closed that book and I just stared out into space. And my husband, who'd been watching me as I'd finished the book, was like, wow, I haven't seen you so lost in a book like that. And he's been trying to get his mitts on the book since, but I was preparing for today, so he can have it after today. There's a number of really striking choices that stood out to me in this novel. And the first one was that you tell so much of the story. I think the majority of the story is through the eyes of the children that are born to the women of the island. So on the one hand, you have the innocence of their games and their imagination. They're teasing one another, they're playing with one another. This sort of like cheeky, childish spirit of doing exactly what they have been told not to do. So they're like sneaking around and listening in on things that they shouldn't be listening to, or seeing things that they're not meant to. But at the same time, on the other hand, you have the punctuation of their language with really adult language, and the normalization of the brutalizing of their mothers that they witness. And it just stands in such stark contrast. So I wanted to ask if you could talk about the decision to filter so much of this story through the children's perspective, and what that narrative distance allowed you to do that perhaps telling the story through an adult narrator couldn't have achieved. I'm assuming that.
Thank you. No, that's great. And actually, you've touched on the two main decisions that I made. Um, and one of them was, making the story about the uprising and not about, just a sort of story of trauma. And
Mm,
the other was writing in the collective voice. And point of view is a really important choice. And in this case, the point of view of the collective we voice. So the story is told through the eyes of the children in a collective voice. So they say we, and it's not one child, it's all the children speaking like a Greek chorus. And what that
mm,
allowed me to do really was if I told the story from the perspective of the women, very bluntly, you would have to experience the world through their eyes. And I think that's almost possible for us to do. Um, there are moments when you enter their point of view, but mostly you're seeing it through their children, and it means that you have a tiny bit of distance through the innocence of the children, and also that sense of dread because they know that when they reach a certain age, that's also going to be them.
Mm.
So it was just creating that tension. It was creating a little bit of distance, as you said. It was just allowing the reader to kind of look at this world without necessarily being completely in the world the whole time.
Mm. And I know that you spent time with these women. Have any of them read the story? Are they able to know what you wrote? How do they feel about it?
Hmm. That's a really good question. So the women on the island do not read and write for the most part, um, in a very basic way. I felt that I told them I was writing this novel, and I had written most of it before I went to the island because I didn't want the story to be about real people.
Mm.
So I'd written most of it and I came to them and I think they just wanted to relate to me as a human. They didn't have a lot of questions about the book or about my writing life. They wanted to know, do you have a husband? How many children do you have? They wanted to see pictures of my family. And then when I came back to London, we talk a lot on video. And I showed them a map and I said, this is where you live and this is where I live and this is how far away we are and this is my home. And I introduced them to my kids and said hello. And so we relate as people, but it's, I think, difficult in that situation to grasp that there might be a novelized account or some kind of fictionalized account of they want me to celebrate Eid with them. They want me to tell them what I'm doing in Ramzan. I mean, it's like much more of a sort of human connection.
That's so interesting. There's a question from Shayla actually in the question box. So she's asked, "Will the male children also experience the same future?" And you do touch on that in the book. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure, yeah. It's a little bit of a twist in the book, and I don't want to give away too much.
Mm.
Um, but I think that the one of the kind of context or premises of the book is that it's an island where there are no men. And that is both a terrible thing because the women are subjected to male violence, but there is something about a completely woman space that has the ability to do what happens in the story, which is like create a revolution. So when I went to the island, one of the things that I noticed was that obviously these women are very poor, they live in very difficult circumstances. But there was something about the fact that they lived away from society, where they were only surrounded by women, and there was no one to judge them. There was no one to say, "Oh, shame on you." And the fact that it was an island slightly protected them from some of the like state violence, police violence that other brothels in other parts of Bangladesh experience. So I think that I deliberately created an all-female space for the
Mm.
children and for the women.
Mm, that's so interesting. One of the reasons why I reached out to you to speak about this book is actually that I found the story very universal. Yes, obviously it's in a very particular context. It's, sort of couched in a very specific language and culture, but I really felt that the themes are so transcendent. Um, and one of my bugbears is comparisons to The Handmaid's Tale. I think it's so lazy. And I've seen one literary review that does liken Uprising to The Handmaid's Tale. And yet, I have to be honest, I do in this instance get it. Yes, because for me, the prostitutes, the children, of course, refer to as the mothers throughout, which I thought again that was so interesting because, I'll come back to this point later in our conversation, but these women were both prostitutes and mothers, both what in society, the mother is sort of
Mhm.
held as this, the greatest attainment a woman can achieve, and they're romanticized and all the rest of that, while the prostitute is on the other end of the spectrum. And yet here in this book, we're reminded that these
Mhm.
same prostitutes are also the mothers. Um, But anyway, my point in this question was really to talk about how the prostitutes, these women who are the most downtrodden in their society, they are the ones tricked into the guiles of men and then forced into sexual violence by means of false promises, and then they're comatose through chemically and medically
Yeah.
induced sedation, which they, of course, they become addicted to. I really felt like they represented women generally who are entirely limited and exploited by the patriarchy. They're hurt and used by it and yet continue to remain often willingly in its servitude.
Mhm.
And then also, of course, we have Amma, their madam, who essentially owns them. And this reminded me of the aunts in The Handmaid's Tale and the sorts of women, again, we see in various societies and cultures who uphold violent patriarchies, who serve its need and ensure its continuation through the generations, despite having been a victim of this system themselves. And just when I finished reading this book, we had, of course, that CNN report on the online rape academy released and the subsequent discourse around it. And that's when I reached out to you and I was like, Tahmima, I'm literally apoplectic with anger right now. So did you think when you were writing this that you were writing such a meta story, such a universal story as you were writing it? Or, is that just an indictment of the world we live in? Like just how naturally universal this novel is?
I mean, look, I want to say yes,
Mm,
but only because I feel your anger. I feel the anger of so many women. I feel a sort of generationally inherited rage. I feel like I was duped. I grew up thinking that I was going to leave behind a better, more just world for my daughter than the one I grew up in. Just as my mother, who is a, lifelong feminist activist, really believed, my mother still goes on marches in Dhaka. She has been campaigning for different kinds of legal reforms her entire life that she believed was going to leave for me a different world, a different legal context, a different social context than the one she grew up in. And so I feel like I got screwed, frankly,
mm,
because that myth that we were working towards equality, that we were that the things that were not perfect or that were not equal were moving towards a sense of like greater justice. That myth, I feel, has been completely abandoned. That narrative has been abandoned. We no longer can believe that. We're facing assaults on every level, whether it's legal, political, social, and technology is only really increasing that sense of division between our expectations and what we're seeing out in the world.
mm,
So I really did want to write a story that was an indictment of not one particular system or one particular set of women, but of a system that we all exist in, that in some ways we all perpetuate,
mm,
because we are created by the system and we create the system in a sort of like dialectic, in a sort of like circular fashion. And Amma, you hear her story, you hear how she was trafficked and what led her to become, one of the women of the island. And yet she is really the person who is in that sense continuing on that tradition of trafficking, of violence, of, entrapment. So, I mean, I hate that this is a universal story, but
mm,
it was my only way of responding to what I see as a kind of uh, growing injustice that is only getting worse, that is only getting more pointed, that is only being reinforced by the sort of models that we're seeing out in the leadership, in political leadership, all the basic repeals of rights that we're seeing in different kind of legal contexts. So yeah, I mean, I could talk about this for hours. This was my way. This was my act of civil disobedience. And I know that, Sophia, you have your acts of civil disobedience, which are incredibly powerful. Um, but this is how we use our voices. This is how we express, at least we can express our anger.
yeah. And it's so tempting, right? That when you are raging at something is just to set everything on fire, just to respond to the severity of the violence that we see around us with equal and greater rage. But what I love about what you're doing is that you're channeling it into something that could really potentially help in changing the minds of people. I think because I think literature is such an incredibly powerful way to get people to think. You mentioned there about how not, we end up co-creating the very systems that we are trying to fight very often. Unintentionally it can and does happen. What literature does and what a book like yours does so beautifully is it allows us to step outside of ourselves and to be able to see ourselves in the various characters and go, oh, okay, and it's really easy, I think, to villainize a character like Amma, because you end up having these two individuals. You have Kusum, who, is at the center of the uprising. And you have Amma, who is the madam that sort of overlooks and maintains the island. And it's really tempting to just to see them in this dichotomous way, right? But I want us to interrogate that a little bit. So Kusum is, of course, the one who's at the center of the uprising. She's the one, it's really sweet. The children are convinced that she's this mythical Bon Bibi, the goddess or protector of the forest. This was completely new to me. I Googled that and I found it such a fascinating sort of mythology as well. And I loved, Kusum's focus on education as a means to awakening the children and their mothers into a consciousness of their circumstance and the potential of a single rebel, taking an entire generation out of its subjugation. I loved the hope that you gave in Kusum. And I don't want to give away obviously too much, but I was curious about this juxtaposition of Kusum and Amma. Both arrive on the island through the same betrayal. Both of them were deceived, they were trafficked, both of them, had the same starting point of victimhood. And yet they couldn't end up in more opposing places. So, like I said, Amma becomes the maintainer and upholder of this system that, essentially destroyed her, whilst Kusum becomes its undoing. What was it that you wanted to explore in that fork in the road, that moment where a survivor either internalizes their subjugation and perpetuates it, or finds a way to refuse it? And do you think the novel asks us to judge Amma or to understand her? I feel like I asked you two questions in there, but I know
I'm
you
going to take
can
the
handle
second one first because I love that question. You know, as a novelist, the one of the reasons that I didn't become an anthropologist and I became a novelist instead is because I'm allowed to ask questions and not answer them.
it. Mm.
So in my second novel, The Good Muslim, there are a pair of siblings and they both survived the Bangladesh War of Independence. One becomes a feminist activist and a doctor, and the other one becomes a very, very strict Muslim religious leader. And this is true in my family. My mother's older brother is the head of Tablighi Jamaat in Bangladesh. He's the emir of Tablighi Jamaat.
Oh,
And
wow.
my mother is like a very kind of prominent women's rights activist in Bangladesh. So I grew up with these two opposing views of what it means to live a moral life because they both believe that they're living this moral life. And in my life, I definitely judge one of them. I definitely uh, ally myself with one of these two characters. But in the novel, it was important to me to ask the question and to humanize both of the characters so that you can see that sometimes decisions come out of certain contexts that we can't see. And so I wanted Amma, you definitely hate Amma in the story. You can't help
Yeah.
it. She's so brutal. She's so violent. She has really bought into what she believes is her role as the mother
Mm.
figure. And I think she feels she's protecting them, you know, as she's drugging them so that they don't have to like fully experience the violence of being continually raped, essentially. She she's there to kind of look after them when they're sick. She dispenses medicine. She's there when their children are born. She also, in a way, kind of protects the children from their mothers because the mothers become violent towards the children. And because Amma owns every body on the island, she also owns the children. So she kind of protects them from their mothers when their mothers are beating them. So she's definitely a character that you are allowed to be really, really mad at when you read the book. But I also told her backstory so that you can see that she was created by the same system. And in the case of Kushum, Kushum's political awareness comes from having been part of an uprising. So she grows up in the city and she witnesses the overthrowing of the main kind of political leader of Bangladesh. So that person is not named. The uprising itself is not named, but she participates. She's only the daughter of a poor fruit seller, but because she has this incredible voice, she gets co-opted by this movement that is essentially a movement by like young intelligentsia. And she stands in front of the picket line and she sings these revolutionary songs and everybody follows her. And she becomes radicalized or she becomes aware. She says that when the police come to beat the protesters, they sort of take their batons and they beat the legs of the protesters. And she says the policeman doesn't know if he's beating the legs of a poor person or an educated person. And that feels to her that when I'm standing in the front of a picket line, I am the same as everyone else. And so she brings that spirit with her to the island. So first she tries to escape. She's only in it for herself. I'm going to get out of here. She tries to like bribe her way out of there. She tries to run away. When she realizes that she's trapped, she then says, "You're all going to come with me. I'm getting out of here and you're all coming with me." And she brings that revolutionary language with her.
Mm. Oh, I just absolutely love that. I actually want to ask you a little bit more about Kusum. I realized I was pronouncing it Kusum because I was just saying
I
it as
know,
I was
because there's
reading it.
no H. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
just a
So, because there is the figure of Bon Bibi in there, um, and it is through the children's eyes. And Kushum does sort of reject it, but then there's moments when she almost plays with it with the children.
yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about that actually. Was it important to you that the women's liberation in this novel also be rooted in something sacred? Because of course, Bon Bibi is a goddess and
Yes.
something that's pre-existing rather than only and purely in a political awakening,
Yeah.
which you have mentioned. And I wondered if grounding resistance in myth, what were you saying about where women have historically had to locate their power when
Mm.
every other avenue is closed to them? Because something that I find is that an accusation I'm often met with is well, one of two. One is, well, religion is inherently patriarchal, especially the Abrahamic faiths. So what on earth are you doing trying to seek any
Yeah.
sort of, feminist liberation through Islam of all religions?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there are, co-religionists, other Muslims who will say to me that what you are saying is inherently wrong and cannot be accepted as a way of reading the religion. So, you're stuck in both spaces. But for me, going back to something that pre-exists all of this and that transcends all of this is really important to me. Um, so yeah, if you
This
could
is
speak.
why I have so much respect for you, Sophia, because I think that you do something that I've never seen anyone do. And if I had grown up listening to you, I may have had a different relationship to my faith than I do now. So I have to say that I think what you're doing is really extraordinary. And it's based in so much scholarship and so much learning. And you're really kind of educating the rest of us. So I really salute you.
Oh.
Um, I think what you're saying is totally right, which is that when we think about our liberation, which we must think about, we must always bear in mind that our goal in life is to be free, is to be equal, is to demand respect. We can never forget that. It's easy to forget because the Rape Academy and the sort of like deep fakes and they can be so overwhelming.
Mm.
But as we live our lives, in parallel to our lives must be the song of protest that lives alongside us. And in that song of protest, we call upon not only the tools that are available to us, our collective action, the books that we read, the marches that we go on, the ways that we advocate, the microfeminisms, the macrofeminisms, but we also get to call on the sacred myths, the deities, the sort of like pre-existing narratives of liberation that
Mm.
are available to us. And Bon Bibi is one of them. Bon Bibi is, a story of a baby who is abandoned in the forest by her mother. And she is raised by the animals of the forest. And she then becomes the protector of the forest. And Sundarban, she is a deity of that particular place where the island is located and where the novel takes place. Um, and I wanted, so the children, they don't have school, they don't have parents, they don't have anything. All they have are is their imagination. And they hear this myth about Bon Bibi. And when Kusum arrives on the island, they decide she is Bon Bibi.
Mm.
Okay. And she spends the whole time saying, I'm not Bon Bibi. This is not real. I'm going to teach you the alphabet. I'm going to teach you the national anthem. I'm going to teach you about your rights. Don't talk to me about Bon Bibi. But at some point in the story, Kushum realizes, or even starts to believe herself, that there is something of the divine in the desire for liberation, in the act of protest. There is something in the divine. And I really believe that as a feminist myself, as a woman who walks the earth. And I know that you do. And so Kushum gets to call on that, even though she knows that she is not Bon Bibi, or even though she believes that she is not Bon Bibi. Uh, and there, that's an incredibly powerful moment when she says, yes, I am Bon Bibi. And she is summoning that sort of pre-existing, ancient, mythological power.
It's just so interesting to me. I write a lot on the wife of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Aisha, and it's so interesting to me. I do events, I'll talk about, I've written two books about her. One is A Treasury of Aisha, and then the other one is Gendering the Hadith Tradition, which is my PhD as a monograph. And I've been to events where, I'm introduced as Dr. Sofia Rehman. I am Sophia. I have no other identity other than that I am Sophia Rehman.
Yes.
And yet, when I'm doing book signings or people come to me afterwards, I get called Aisha so many times. So it's funny. And then, like, I've actually had people say to me, oh, when I read about Aisha, I mean, this is far beyond what I'm worthy of, but, like, people be like, I imagine you. And that's
Mm.
really striking. But it's almost sometimes people need to see what they think is an embodiment of a figure that they know is astoundingly powerful and yet in so many ways has been managed in their imagination. And so to have that unleashed for them is so incredibly powerful in allowing them to step into their own agencies. It's almost like they have to see it to be able to believe that it resides in them as well, the ability to make those changes. So I just loved all of that. I think it's so powerful what you've done in this.
And you have a daughter named Aisha.
I do. I have a daughter named Aisha
Yeah.
as well. Yeah, I do. So it's just, yeah, Aisha abounds around me in ways that I
Yeah.
I couldn't have ever conceived would happen. Um, I want to talk about the men. We've had the question earlier about, what happens to the male children who are born onto this island. And I had so many passages I wanted to read. And then I realized that this would just end up being an hour of me reading passages from this book, but this I wanted to read. So
If I freeze, you can do that
I'll
for
do
the
that's
rest
what
of the
I'll do.
time.
I have so many, so let's make that the plan. So this is from one of the chapters towards the sort of end of the book, and it's just called The Men. And I just wanted to read this. This is as the uprising is happening, right? Um, they landed. They had taken this journey before. They had danced and laughed with our mothers. They had their favorites, one they would visit again and again, declaring themselves weakened by desire, even love. But here in the moonless dark, their minds were emptied of all that. They thought only of what had been taken from them. They were possessed with rage at the audacity of a silent island, of lights switched off, of women sleeping undisturbed. And so they disturbed them. They entered their huts and hurled themselves onto our mothers, their fists and knees and pricks and ferocious biting mouths. They beat and kicked and maimed and bruised. How could it be that something that had occurred 1,000 times to one body could feel so entirely different? In many instances, it was even the same two bodies. These were the men who had been coming to the island for years, the regulars that Amma knew and had cultivated over time. Our mothers had known these bodies, and yet, in their ambush, they seemed to be having a better time than any of the other times, hitting our mothers as hard as they liked, not worried that Amma would scold them for leaving marks, laughing like wolves, delighted by the anarchy of it all. It wasn't even that they spent no money, had brought no trinkets to please our mothers. It was the untethered freedom of it. That is why they loved it so. Ugh. Can you see why I had to keep stopping as I was reading this? Again, this spoke to something so universal. the Madonna and the whore paradigm that's often talked about in feminist critiques, and how men respond to these female archetypes, and how when women refuse to fit neatly into these boxes, they're punished. They're punished by these very same men. And there is not one redeemable male character in this book. It seemed to say, it's all men until we know it's no men. Was that a deliberate choice? And were you at all concerned about how it might be perceived?
So, thank you for reading that so beautifully. I really appreciate it. I want to answer your question, but the first thing I want to say is that this is a story about a strike. Okay, this is a story about women refusing to do the thing that everyone thinks that they were born to do, which is be sex workers. And I think we have seen, there were two big stories that came out in the Telegraph and the New Statesman, the cover story, basically about women who are refusing to do the thing that we are expected to do, which is to bear children, essentially. And I think it's terrifying for society to imagine a world in which women refuse to do that because it will mean the end of the species. Okay. So you see this paranoia, and it's like talking about women being radicalized, comparing feminism to the manosphere, even though we know that one is a movement for liberation and one is a movement to basically oppress women and to create a hierarchy, or perpetuate or make worse. So this is like a deep-seated fear. So I wanted to write about that in this context, which is what happens when these women say no, and what happens when women who have no business saying no say no. They have no rights anyway. What are they going to say no to? It seems ridiculous that a group of prostitutes would say no to sex. And
Mm.
yet that is what they do. And that is why these men come in the night and rape them, because they say, how dare you not be available to me sexually? How dare you not fulfill this role? How dare you, even in your poverty, even in your desperation, say no to me? So that is what I was trying to say. Now, in terms of the men, look, I think that the not all men thing is totally ridiculous. We all know that
Mm.
even the most man-hating woman doesn't hate all men. We all have fathers, we have brothers, we have sons. Like my desire to for a more just world has nothing to do with my like or dislike or love or lack of love for men. We all know that nobody is saying all men. Not
Mm.
even the most kind of ferociously man-hating person is saying all men. Nobody's saying that. Having said that, in this book, I had zero interest in the male gaze. I there are men who are slightly more sympathetic than others towards the end. But I don't think it's my job to make men look sympathetic in this book. We know that it's not all men. This story is about the system that oppresses us all, and this story is about the people that are oppressed the most by the system. And in order to tell that story from their perspective, no one is coming to get them. No man is coming to rescue them. They have a fantasy that one of these men is going to take them away and marry them, and they're going to have a farm and they're going to have a shop or whatever. None of that ever happens. We know that that doesn't happen. Pretty Woman never happens. Okay, that's not a real story. And so, in order to tell that story in all its truth, it was important not to uh, incorporate the male gaze. And the male gaze is redeeming men or saying not all men. And there are many contexts in which I will very lovingly say, I don't believe it's all men. But I didn't feel the need to do that in this book. In this
Mm.
book, I wanted to talk about the reality for these women and for many women, which is that they experience male violence on a regular basis. And trying to say no to that violence is the thing that ultimately leads to their destruction. And
Mm.
that is terrifying for the men.
Mm. Gosh, yeah. And I think also it touches so importantly on the fact that for women who are so regularly and entirely immersed in a system whereby they are continuously met by the violence of men, for them it is all men. That there is, even if they're met by a man that doesn't have those intentions, they have to assume that that is the intention with which that man is coming. And so, yeah, distilling that and refusing to pander to the male gaze is just so important. Because actually the fear with which young women especially often navigate the world is it permeates everything. And so to have a story that allows that to permeate everything and not allow sort of the male intrusions into that, it's a really powerful move to make. So thank you for that. I really appreciate what you've done there. I
I'll keep
want
you posted when I get the why did you make the men look so bad um, comments.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, I get this often as well, this question of what are men's reactions to your work? Um, and I have to say, often it is positive. The overwhelming response is actually
Yeah.
positive. The negative response is loud, but in the minority. Um, but mainly it's fine. And honestly, it's not my primary concern. I'm speaking primarily to
Yeah.
the women and the girls and the young men. I do want to
Yeah.
reach them
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
Because it's important that they're raised with that empathy for women. But otherwise, it's not really the main primary concern that I have. So it's not something I focus on. Susanna has a question. I think it's an important one. She said, researching and writing such a difficult story, has it affected you in any way, changed the way you will go forward in life, whether personally or professionally? And how have you looked after yourself during the process of writing it? I have to admit, I did wonder that as well. But I've also read your Bengal trilogy, so I know this isn't like your first rodeo.
That's a really good question, and thank you for asking it with such empathy. So I had a very interesting experience writing this book, which is that I found it quite shocking that I had it in me to write such terrible things. I actually thought, what does that say about me? That I was able to imagine such a darkness. It made me feel like I was some kind of psychopath or something. And there was this one day I was sitting in my parents' house in Bangladesh and I wrote the scene and I became physically ill. I had this terrible, I was so ill. I had to lie down for 24 hours. And I think it was just the shock. It was, and you'll know Sophia because you read the book, it was a scene when Amma, the scene about Amma basically and what
Mm,
happens to her and how she becomes Amma. And I thought, why is this image in my mind? Why do I know this story? So it was quite disturbing. And what I did eventually is that I've written all of my books in the context of family life. My except for the first book that I wrote, the other four have all been written post children, and literally with like a baby cot, sharing. This happens to me, this beautiful office, but I only got it a few years ago. I've always written in rooms where there's been a child that I've shared the room with. So in the thrum of family life, and I love that. I love being kind of I never was interested in taking myself away. But when I was writing this book, I had to go away somewhere.
mm,
So I went and stayed with my sister-in-law, and I didn't sort of like I wasn't in the family. I wasn't being around the children because I just had to go to a different place. And that really helped. That really helped. I wrote the bulk of the story kind of not around my family. And I think I just had to accept that any one of us could have written this book because we have a key, we live these lives, of joy and celebration and just living through life in our delightful ways. But we have this deep knowledge of what it means to be a woman. And there are some really dark things that happen to women. And I think we all know what those things are. And I just happen to be putting them in this story. But I think we all live with those stories. I don't know a single woman in my life who has not experienced some form of abuse of some kind.
mm.
Um, and we have to live alongside that. That story exists alongside the story of the rest of our lives. I just happen to put it in this book.
I remember being at university and I was visiting my friend in her dorms. And we all ended, it just ended up being one of those gatherings that sort of spontaneously happened in her kitchen. And before we knew it, I think there was maybe about 15 of us just sitting around chatting and eating, and then the conversation took like a really deep turn, like as they so often do. And I remember there was this moment where we were all like, hey, has anyone here not experienced inappropriate language or touch from a man? And we were 18, 19. And in that room of 15 or however many of us there was, not a single one of us was able to say no. And that always stays with me. It was so shocking. Um, and so, yeah, I completely appreciate what you're saying about, again, the sort of not everybody has the experience that is the extreme that you find in this book. But of course, everyone can find something that resonates within the themes that you are that you're bringing to light in it. Um, and so, yeah, I can well imagine that you would have had to take time out to process all of this, because no matter what your experience is, I'm sure nobody's experience is to the degree that these women have had. And so I can only imagine, like, for you to be so immersed in that story and writing it. And yeah, thank you for your efforts and, bringing this story into the world for us, because it's an important one. I've got another question in the chat, but I am going to say to everybody, if you'd like to raise your hand, you can use the react button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll come to you and you can unmute yourselves and turn on your videos if you'd like to say your question instead. In the meantime, I've got Sheila's got another question. She said, it's going back to your research. She says, how did you feel personally when you were at the island? Was it anger or sadness or frustration or sympathy towards the women?
That's a great question. So the interesting thing about the island, the way that it exists today, is I think it is an island that Kusum has already been to, in the sense that the women of the island have a union, they have a leader, they have a lot of sexual health education, they have a lot of NGOs that come to the island, which isn't to say that their lives are lives of comfort and ease and, the kind of rights and expectations that you and I have. But if you read Uprising, that island is probably like an island when you first encounter it before any changes have happened. When I talked to some of the older women of the island, they said, "Oh, when I arrived here, I was indentured. In other words, they were in debt to the person who brought them there. They had to pay off that debt before they could earn money." And they said, but the young women who come today are not in debt. They can come and go as they please. They're not trapped in a kind of cycle of debt, right? And so already talking about some of the changes that have taken place since some of the older women were there. Um, and I don't think it's my job to feel sorry for anybody. Obviously, I was there kind of relating to them as women. And we developed whatever kind of friendship that we could in that short amount of time. And I felt a huge amount of respect for them. They were so warm towards me. They wanted me to stay and eat with them. I didn't, because I didn't want to take what little food that they had. And we kept in touch and they were hugging me and I have pictures with them. And um, they just embraced me in a way that they needn't have, just as a person. So I didn't feel sorry for them, but I had a keen awareness of our otherness. That while I could relate to so much in some way being a woman, I live a life of enormous, enormous privilege. And that was my overwhelming sensation when I left. That I just kind of floated away on this boat and I never have to go back there if I don't want to. Not just physically, but even in my mind. I can live in a world in which I never have to think about women who live those lives. And that's just an experience of privilege. That's a condition of who we are and of all the things that we take for granted.
The Safana has her hand up, so I'm going to take it over to Safana.
For the very first time.
Mhm.
And I would also like to congratulate Tahmima because we successfully produced a PhD thesis on the text. Um like it was based on the text written in 1971 Pakistan, the national history, and how the grand narratives have been de-totalized in these texts. And one of the great core texts were Tahmima's Anams, the I guess the bones of grace. So I would like to congratulate to her as well, and all the best for her upcoming novel. Acha, my understanding and my when I first heard the idea, uh, being a South Asian, we cannot deny the presence of Bollywood in our lives. So the text is what I had like it was quite close to Gangubai. I hope you have watched the movie last or a couple of years back. It was a very successful movie. So how Tahmima actually departs from the South Asian cult of feminism by putting characters or like Gangubai or Bina Shah's Before She Sleeps, a dystopian sort of a text, and how Uprising is going to be a different text as compared to these two pre-existing narratives on female agency. I hope I have made my point clear, though I was
Yes.
fumbling.
No, no. Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I have not seen that film. I do think that there are examples in literature and film of situations like this, of, women being trapped in a particular context and then finding some kind of liberation. I think that's a very, they say that there are only seven basic plots. And I think that a journey from kind of a status quo that everybody accepts to a kind of revolutionary change is one that we experience not just in literature and art, but in life. That is the story of every uprising. And, I love that Camus quote, which is, I rebel, therefore we exist. And that means that because one person says no to a system, the rest of us are allowed to exist outside of that system. And I think that we're all here today because some ancestor of ours stood up for the right for women to vote, for, us to be kind of free beings, for our nations not to be colonized. So I think that is really the universal story of humanity, is revolutionary change that brings about some of the privileges that we enjoy today. So I'm delighted to be part of that tradition. Whatever specific stories may have come before this one, I think that's only something that I honor.
What do they say? That prostitution is like the oldest vocation going,
Profession, yeah.
and we see it every time there's a technological advancement of any sort, the thing that's quite often first exploited through it is women and girls.
Yeah.
So it just seems to be an inherent outcome of a patriarchal society that any progress that we make. I mean, for example, I recently read Laura Bates's latest book on AI
Yes.
and the dangers of AI, and how the dangers of AI are not some futuristic um, scare
Yeah.
story that we need to be thinking about. They're here already. They're already impacting our daughters. They're already impacting us. I read just today that Apple and I can't remember what the other platform was, but that they are actively promoting apps that nudify women and girls. And the stories that Laura Bates has to tell, the research that she's done that shows that these nudify apps are singularly being used by men to nudify women and girls is a horrifying reality. It's not women that are doing it. Women do not use these apps. And what was really just so really struck me through her research is that whilst a small percentage of the women that were being nudified by these apps were celebrities or politicians or women who are in the public eye, the majority of women whose images were being used by these men are neighbors, colleagues,
Mm.
random women they've snapped a picture of in the streets. They're women who are in their closer circles. It's women who are in
Mm.
their families and in their homes. And alongside that, when you know that rape statistics as well show that the majority of rape victims are not women that were just randomly out on a jog and attacked by a stranger, but are victims in their own homes by men that they know. I mean, I think when we look at statistics like that, and the reality of violence against women and how close it is to home, and how every sort of technological advancement is first used in the service of these sorts of things, it means that there's no limit on the number of stories that we can have like this that alert us to these dangers and make us aware of these harms that continue to be perpetuated, and really in every register as well. So I just love this book and what it's doing. And I think that it's a really important contribution to a body of works, whether that's literary or whether that's movies or whatever it may be, that are part of the resistance to this kind of harm. I do realize that we've hit the hour, and I said I would be really good and try and stick within the hour, but I did also say that I probably won't. So I'm going to take one more question if that's okay, and that's from Suma. She said, and again, it's going back to your process, Tahmima. She says she wondered how you navigated heavy themes and discussions coming from the mouths of children. So, did you speak to the children on the island? And what was that like writing the scenes for the children, especially as a mother as well? I imagine that brings another layer to that.
Yeah, so I did not speak with the children. I saw some children around the island, but I didn't kind of interact with them. Um, sometimes as a novelist, you just have to do this arrogant thing of imagining what it's like to be someone else. And I think this is probably the furthest I've ever gone, which is imagining looking at the world through a child's eyes. And it's really just it's it was really a choice that I made because it made telling that story possible. I think that story would not have been possible had it been told through the eyes of the women. I think it would have been impossible to write, and I think it would have been impossible to read. And so it was a kind of stylistic choice that I made. And at the end of the day, I think it sort of succeeds or fails on the basis of whether it's convincing and whether it kind of does its job. And I think for the people of the island, the way that I can most respect them is by relating to them as humans, and trying to envision a radically different world for them.
I'm going to end this on Zuzana's comment because I hope that this is what everybody has been left with. She said, "It's safe to say I'm going to buy all of your books." Now, Tahmima, thank you for taking the time to talk to us about your book with us. I mean, yeah, I just extend that same gratitude again to Tahmima. You've been so generous, not only in the writing of this book, but also in answering all of our questions. Guys, don't wait for it to actually hit the bookshops. Do go out and pre-order, put in your pre-orders now. And inshallah, get your book clubs reading it as well. Order it into your libraries as well. Thank you so much, Tahmima. Thank you everybody for being here and for asking your questions. And
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Sophia. That was absolutely delightful. I really, really meant so much to me.
my pleasure. Thank you, Tahmima.
Bye-bye.
Bye.